Hello and welcome to another class. This is number 17 of History 1378, and which means we're well on our way, probably 10 or so, give or take, maybe one or two, on either side, and we'll be done. A lot of that just depends on how detailed we get into the things we're talking about as we get into more contemporary issues that are often, more interesting and better known to people. But we're doing well. We've made good progress. As always, keep up on this. Do the reading. Check the videos out. You can subscribe to the videos on YouTube. And the final exam is set by UH. So if you want to know the precise date of that, you can go to the UH website, look for the academic calendar, and it'll tell you when the exams are scheduled for, Tuesday, Thursday classes at 2:30 and 4. Obviously, we're not meeting at those precise times, but that's how they organize it, so you can get the information there. On YouTube, you can also subscribe to this so that whenever a new video comes out, you'll get notified. We've been doing that. The TAs and I have been sending out, emails about that, so that shouldn't be a problem. So where we are now is well into the 20th century, into the post-World War II era. We talked about the 50s and the Cold War and McCarthyism and, the kind of counterculture that was being created in the 1950s, which is going to be important, down the road when we talk about the 60s. And after that, the other day, we started talking about the Vietnam War, which is an area that's still really popular. A lot of movies about it, a lot of TV shows, a lot of references to it in popular culture. Whenever the United States gets involved in another country, people write, is this another Vietnam, or how does this compare to Vietnam? You may know people in your families, uncles, grandparents, parents, whatever, who fought in Vietnam. Houston has one of the biggest Vietnamese communities in the United States. I think it's the second or third largest, which is, really important culturally and economically in the area. And so it's something you probably know something about already, a little bit about already, and we're going to go into a little more detail about it. So we're going to start. The other day, the map didn't show up, so I just put one on here. It's a big one, and we'll go back time to time if I need to. I'm not going to go into great detail here because, like I said, you could spend a lot of time on this. In fact, if any of you are interested, on my YouTube page where this class is posted, there's a History 3322 class posted as well, and that's Vietnam War. So that's an entire semester of lectures on Vietnam. So if you're really interested in this, you can follow along and check that out as well, on your own. All right, so that's Vietnam. Remember, Vietnam is part of what was called French Indochina: Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam. Vietnam had three regions: Tonkin in the north, Annam in the central region, and then down in the south it was called Cochin China. And that's important because remember, I told you the Vietnamese had a history of nationalism and fighting against foreign occupiers. And in the kind of modern era, it was France from like the 1860s onward had controlled Vietnam in a very brutal fashion. The Vietnamese resisted. That led to the rise of Ho Chi Minh, who's the most beloved national figure of Vietnam, throughout the 20th century into today. And the group of Vietnamese nationalists, the Viet Minh. The Viet Minh were organized and often led by communists who were part of the Communist Party of Indochina, the PCI, the Party Communiste Indochina, which was formed in France. But the Viet Minh was actually a very large group of Vietnamese nationalists. So it wasn't just communists by any means whatsoever. The vast majority of Vietnamese people, not just the communists, wanted the French out. And then during World War II, Japan came in and occupied Vietnam in a very brutal manner, and the Viet Minh fought against them. That was part of the resistance. And so when World War II ended and Japan was defeated, the Vietnamese assumed that they would be independent. And Ho Chi Minh, remember I said, gave that speech in September of 1945, where he proclaimed Vietnamese independence and actually quoted almost directly from the American Declaration of Independence. If you want to know more about Ho, I think I mentioned this the other day, there's a podcast we did where we go into some detail. I go into some detail about Ho Chi Minh's life and importance. That didn't happen. The independence didn't happen. France returned because that was part of its colonial empire. It wanted to regain control of Vietnam. The United States didn't think it was the best idea by any means, but gave up, gave in. They said, yeah, we won't stop you, because the United States didn't want to alienate the French. They didn't want to get the French angry at America, because, the Cold War in Europe was way more important, and they wanted France to remain, kind of a strong advocate, a strong ally, fighting against communism in the Soviet Union. France came back in, and that led to the First Indochina War. So from 1946 to 1954, the Viet Minh fought against the French. This massive, still, we make a lot of jokes about the French army in World War II, but, had a lot of weapons, it had a lot of military. It's a European army against this basically guerrilla army, the Viet Minh. I think you've all probably heard that phrase, guerrilla warfare. Actually, I think I even have the word down here. Yeah, I was going to talk about it later. Guerrilla. It means like little war. And guerrilla warfare is not like World War II, where you had tanks and you had aircraft dropping bombs and, big armies and all that kind of thing. Guerrilla war has smaller units. It's often referred to as irregular warfare. It involves sabotage. It involves maybe, blowing up power plants, assassinating local officials, sending 6 or 8 people out to, attack a village or something like that. So it's a very different type of warfare. Now, they can convert to more regular forms of warfare. And in the American War, there was a large regular army, the PAVN, the People's Army of Vietnam, which was situated in the north. All right. But the Viet Minh, the First Indochina War was mostly guerrilla tactics, as was much of the American War too. And even though, this small country, this very poor country using guerrilla tactics was fighting against this very big, powerful European army, the Vietnamese won these decisive battles at Dien Bien Phu. Here are a couple of articles I've written. If you want kind of a detailed, understanding of the first, it's more than just Dien Bien Phu. The articles actually talk about the First Indochina War, the Viet Minh versus the French. When that ended in 1954, the Vietnamese won. And so just like 1945, Ho and his comrades, both, many of them are communists, but it's more than that. It's bigger than that. At one point in the 50s, the U.S. Army sent intelligence officers to Vietnam. Well, they sent them there. They were deployed there, and they did a lot of studies and analyses of Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh. And the American military actually had great respect for Ho and the Viet Minh, and everybody understood. Remember when we talked about Zhang Jiechi and Mao Zedong, and how all the Americans who went to China understood that Mao was way more popular. When Mao spoke, no dog barked. And the same thing was going on in Vietnam. Everybody who went there said Ho Chi Minh is the most popular politician in Vietnam. It's not even close. One army study said that 80% of the Vietnamese people supported the Viet Minh, but 80% of those supporters were not communist. So that indicates this is a much larger movement. Now that's important, because down the road, when the Americans get really involved in Vietnam, they're going to say 2 things. One, and we've talked about this before, right, with regard to like Iran and Guatemala and Chile and Indonesia and Greece and all kinds of other places. So they're going to say Ho Chi Minh is this communist, which he was, but he is a puppet of the Soviet Union and of China. So they're going to claim that Ho was taking his orders from Moscow and Beijing, and that this is not an independent movement. Nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, with regard to the Chinese, it's insane to think that Vietnam and China have been long traditional enemies. There was definitely Chinese support during the Vietnam War when the Americans were fighting, but that's really about it. And right now, Vietnam and China are still very, very strong enemies. If something goes wrong in Vietnam, they blame China, right? If there's fighting over disputed islands, whenever something happens, your heel breaks on your shoe, you blame the Chinese. The economy goes bad, you blame the Chinese. You get a bad bowl of pho, you blame the Chinese, that kind of thing. So the idea that somehow Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese are taking their orders from China is ridiculous, right? So the United States said that, and then they also would later say that North Vietnam invaded South Vietnam. Now remember, in 1954, after the First Indochina War ended, the United States, instead of recognizing that the Viet Minh had won the war and that Vietnam was now an independent country, cut Vietnam in half. So right up around here is where Vietnam was divided at the 17th parallel, about half the country. Remember, Korea was the 38th parallel. So in the north, this was called the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, the DRV, or the DRVN, and that's led by Ho Chi Minh, and it's basically becoming a communist society. The south, however, I mean, Vietnam's one country. You know, it has these three regions, Tonkin, Annam, Cochin, China, but it's one country. So when it was cut in half, that was an artificial decision made by the United States and the Western Europeans and the Soviet Union, and Chinese went along with it, you know, which is also, I think, you know, more evidence about the idea that, you know, the Viet Minh and Ho Chi Minh were certainly not puppets of you know, the Moscow or Beijing of Khrushchev, who came to power after Stalin died, or, you know, Mao Zedong, right? So because the country is divided in half, and the United States had essentially invented this country to the south. The U.S. sent billions of dollars there. The U.S. helped them build a military. The U.S. sent a lot of advisors there. And then they had to find somebody to put in charge. And that was hard because almost everybody really everybody who the Vietnamese people respected was part of the Viet Minh, and many of them were communists. So they were like off the boards altogether for the United States. They wouldn't even recognize these people, even if they weren't communists, if they were Buddhist, or if they were, you know, just kind of Democrats or liberals, that kind of thing. So they finally settled on this guy, Ngo Dinh Diem, who would become the president of Vietnam from 1954 to 1963. He was, you know, he was out of Vietnam most of the First Indochina War. He was like, you know, not really on the run, but he was in France. He was in the United States, where he met a lot of important Catholic leaders like John F. Kennedy and Francis Cardinal Spellman. So being Catholic helped, because Vietnam is a majority Buddhist country, big majority Buddhist country. But Diem and the people around him were Catholics, which is, you know, I think I mentioned yesterday already, was going to be a problem. So they picked Diem. Now, in 1954, when they divided Vietnam in half, the agreement said that they would have an election in 1956, where they would unify the country and elect somebody to be the president of all of Vietnam. Everybody knew that if you had any kind of election at all, Ho Chi Minh would win it. Dwight Eisenhower was the president, said, you know, if we had an election, Ho would win 90% of the vote. Americans are comparing him, you know, to George Washington. He's like the George Washington of Vietnam. So they canceled the elections, and Vietnam remained divided, north and south, the DRVN versus the RVN. The skirmishing continued. Diem, it's pronounced like with a Z, and his brother, Ngo Dinh Nhu, ran Vietnam. The whole family was kind of involved in it. You know, the Catholic Vietnamese were a big part of Diem's government. If you were Catholic, you were, you know, I mean, a lot of people who were Buddhists converted so that they could get an administrative job or become an official, political official, or maybe get promoted in the army to general or something like that. Diem was very repressive. He and his brother jailed and killed all kinds of political enemies, including Viet Minh. Now, remember, I showed you that brilliant homemade map the other day. I won't put that up again. But the issue becomes, below the 17th parallel here, there are a really big number of Viet Minh. There are a really big number of Vietnamese who do not support Ngo Dinh Diem, who do not support the United States, who want Vietnam to be unified with Ho Chi Minh as president. And they're not happy about this partition of Vietnam at the 17th parallel. So they continue to skirmish. They continue to fight against the RVN, the Republic of Vietnam, which is South Vietnam, right? Southern Vietnam. So the war in Vietnam, because the United States will always say that it's an invasion, the North invaded the South. The reality is that from 1954 onward, it was Vietnamese who were already in South Vietnam, many of them Viet Minh or Viet Minh supporters, who continued to fight against the Ngo Dinh Diem government. They got some support from the North. Sometimes they would go up north for training and then come back. Those were called regroupees. And that was why the Americans said the North was invading the South. Well, in fact, those people were actually Southerners who went back to the North and then came back. Now, later on in the war, the Northern Army, the PAV and the People's Army of Vietnam will fight in the Vietnam War against the Americans, but that's a long way off. But in the most of the early years of the war, I mean the first decade or more of the war, the war is actually in the South, and it's between the Diem government with heavy American support and the Viet Minh who are already in South Vietnam. And in fact, the Viet Minh who became the Viet Cong, C-O-N-G, the name you've all heard, right? Viet Minh and Viet Cong are more or less the same thing. But the Viet Minh and then the Viet Cong had to really put heavy pressure on North Vietnam to actually do more in the South. The Northern policy was essentially to just kind of let Diem destroy himself. He was not popular. He did not have great support, because of he and his brother's very repressive government. And so the North Vietnamese wanted to stay out as much as possible, because if they got in the war, they understood that would probably motivate the United States to get into the war as well against them, or certainly do more. And they didn't want to fight the United States, even though they had just fought the French. Who wants to fight the biggest country in the world, the most powerful military country in the world? I mean, the United States had just, played a decisive role in World War II. It has the biggest economy in the world. It has, planes and ships and guns and soldiers. And, Vietnam is a very small country. Vietnam, the whole country, the square mileage is like 120,000 square miles or something like that. It's about the size of New Mexico. So you have a country that's roughly the same size as New Mexico fighting against the United States, right? And New Mexico is less than half of Texas. So you're talking about a huge disparity, huge difference in power. So the Vietnamese don't want the Americans to come in. So the war mostly is going on in the South, and the North is actually being very careful and hesitant, and begins in 1960, it finally begins to do more, right? And as that occurs, the war gets worse for the South Vietnamese. For Diem, he's repressive. The Viet Minh are more popular. Diem then gets into an open feud with the majority Buddhist of the country. This leads the United States to start to send more and more aid. John Kennedy sent in 16,000 advisors. They called them advisors. Some of them actually participated in military action. The United States sent helicopters to South Vietnam. They sent armor. They sent napalm, which we talked about with regard to World War II, gaseous gel, you have bombs, it burns everything up. They sent Agent Orange, which is a very toxic, carcinogenic defoliant. And the idea behind Agent Orange is it would destroy all the forests, so the Viet Cong, a guerrilla army, wouldn't have a place to hide, and so forth. Didn't really matter. Diem continued these struggles, and then in 1963, with the famous immolation of the bonds Quang Duc in Saigon in June of 1963, the U.S. realized that Diem was a lost cause, and so they kind of quit supporting him. And in November of 1963, Diem and his brother were overthrown by South Vietnamese generals, not by the communists, not by the North, not by Ho Chi Minh, not by the Viet Cong or anybody like that, by South Vietnamese, by their own people. They were overthrown, and the United States began to take more and more action in Vietnam. John Kennedy himself was assassinated a few weeks after that, so Lyndon Johnson became president and continued to support the Vietnamese. Last thing I said the other day was 1964 was an election year. Johnson was running, much like Woodrow Wilson or Roosevelt did, as a peace candidate. That the other candidate that year was a guy named Barry Goldwater, who was kind of a hero to a lot of right-wing people in the United States. He kind of is, in many ways, the father of this modern, really hardcore conservative movement. And Goldwater just, wanted to bomb Vietnam back to the Stone Age. And so Lyndon Johnson said, this guy's, crazy, he's a madman. And I want to tell the mamas of America, you can relax. I'm not going to send your boys to be fighting in Vietnam when there should be Asian boys fighting, right? And of course, as we know, Woodrow Wilson and Roosevelt said the same thing, and look what happened then, right? And so in August of 1964, just a few months before that election, Johnson kind of found a reason, right, to get involved in Vietnam. And you may have heard of this because it's a pretty famous incident. There's an area, that's a map, good. Over here in northern Vietnam, there's an area here called the Gulf of Tonkin. Now, according to international law, you control the coast from 12 miles out. After that, it's international waters. So your territorial waters go out 12 miles. After that, international waters, you can have casinos and monkey knife fights and all kinds of stuff like that. But American ships were doing intelligence reconnaissance missions, trying to get information and intelligence and things like that. And in early August, 2 American ships, the C. Turner Joy and the Maddox, don't worry, you don't have to know the names of that, were in the Gulf of Tonkin inside Vietnam's territorial waters. And the commanders of those ships sent messages back on August 2nd and then again on August 4th that they were attacked by North Vietnamese gunboats. Now, people have been studying this for years, and the reality is that it's almost certain. Well, on August 2nd, it's absolutely certain no attack occurred. And then on August 4th, it's not very clear and probably unlikely that it didn't either. Didn't matter. Lyndon Johnson, in fact, said, those dumb, stupid sailors were probably shooting a damn flying fish. But he used it, right? That becomes, today they use the term false flag, right? But as soon as that happened, Johnson used that to increase the American role in Vietnam, not because the Vietnamese had shot at these 2 American ships. You know, in the big picture, that's not that big a deal, but because Vietnam was in bad shape. After the Diem coup and assassination, things even got worse. So by 1964, the the Viet Cong, Ho Chi Minh, whatever you want to call it, victory is pretty much certain. Everybody knows this is not going well, and it's just going to get worse. So after the Gulf of Tonkin incident, Johnson went to Congress, and he got the House and Senate to pass something called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, and the vote was almost unanimous. It was 416-0 in the House of Representatives and 98-2 in the Senate. So everybody, it's like after 9/11, all those votes, they were virtually unanimous. Like 1 or 2 people voted against, resolutions to start the Homeland Security Department or go to war and all that kind of stuff. So the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and the key to it was, it said that the president, Lyndon Johnson, had the power to protect American interests in Southeast Asia, not just Vietnam, but Cambodia and Laos, that whole region, by any means necessary, right? So Johnson could take action using any means necessary. What's that mean? Johnson said, it's like Granny's nightgown. It covers everything, meaning I can do whatever I want now. There was never a formal declaration of war, so Johnson always justified whatever he did based on the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. And in fact, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was big. It was massive. By any means necessary, right? So the United States by that time now is really involved in the Vietnam War. It began an air campaign, a really kind of significant air war called, the first part of it was called Flaming Dart. And then in early 1965, it began, which was something that was at that time the biggest air war ever, Operation Rolling Thunder. So by 1965, there is a huge American presence in the war, mainly through air power. The United States is sending airplanes, B-52 bombers, which were designed to fight against the Soviet Union and communist troops in Northern Europe, not in some small country, with jungles the size of New Mexico. So the United States is deeply involved. And then in 1965, it began to send troops in, ground troops, beginning in March. And then in July of 1965, it sent like a huge group of soldiers in, an extra 125,000. By 1965, there were over 200,000 American troops in Vietnam. In 1963, when Kennedy died, it had been around 16,000. So the U.S. is firmly and fully involved now in the Vietnam War. Now, remember, I said the Vietnamese are kind of fighting a guerrilla war. The Vietnamese are also fighting a popular war. They have the support of the people. They're fighting, guerrilla tactics. They're already in southern Vietnam. There's still no invasion of South Vietnam from the north. Now, the north would begin to send soldiers in. They're into southern Vietnam across the 17th parallel, but that's still not that significant. The majority of the fighting in the South, the large majority of the fighting in the South, was done by 2 groups, the Viet Cong, which was a guerrilla army, and then another group called the PLAF, the People's Liberation Armed Forces, all right? And that was more of a regular army, but those were Southern units, all right? And the American strategy in Vietnam was to blow it up. So they're, guerrilla wars where you try to win the will of the people over. And people who are critical of the war often compared it to the American War for Independence in the 1770s and 80s, when, the Americans were fighting against the British Empire, this massive, well-equipped army, and used different kinds of tactics and had the support of the people and had morale. The Viet Cong, the Viet Minh, Viet Cong always had this strong morale. They were fighting for their own country. They were fighting to get rid of these people, just like they had fought to get rid of the Mongols and the Chinese and the French and the Japanese, and now it's the Americans. This is a long tradition in Vietnam to get rid of these foreigners who are coming in to try to take over your country. And as a response to that, the Americans just fought wars the way they know how to fight wars, like they fought World War II, which was firepower all over the place. This is just an example. This is a bombing run, which occurred every day, every hour of every day in the Vietnam War. You can see these are very small villages, and this is, this massive bombing run. Okay. So you get some sense then of how the war was being fought. So the United States is waging this typical traditional war, the kind of war you fought in World War II, the kind of war you would fight if, the United States and the Soviet Union ever actually fought against each other in the Cold War. A lot of Americans in Vietnam said this is a bad idea. The Marines, for instance, believed that you should, there was a guerrilla war, and that if, think about that. Look at that, that video there where the United States is just blowing up these areas. Well, those are villages. There were 90% of Vietnam lived along the coast, and so those villages are getting blown up. Those people aren't blaming the communists for that; they're blaming the Americans. So the U.S. Was seen, really as just kind of no different than the French or anybody else. So the United States is sending these huge numbers of troops in. It's doing these bombing runs like that, and it's really kind of destroying Vietnam, which makes things worse. And then in turn, it becomes this vicious cycle, right? As things get worse, the United States sends in more troops and begins more bombing runs and blows up more villages. And then when the Vietnamese turn against them, and by the mid-60s, you do start to see more regular units from the north come in. But as that happens, the war continues just to get worse and worse and worse and worse. The Americans continue to always say, oh, it's going great. And the U.S. criteria for that was that they were killing a lot of Vietnamese, which was true. They, in a guerrilla war, the idea isn't to win a decisive victory against the other side or, kill more of them. The idea is to just fight a long time. It was often called protracted war. And the Vietnamese were ready. Well, they'll fight as long as it takes. They've been fighting forever anyway, right? They've been fighting against the French, 1946. So they're prepared to fight against the Americans in this protracted war. And the United States' goal is just to blow them all up and kill them all off, which is not how you fight against guerrillas, because Vietnam's a big, it's not a big country, but it has a significant population, with millions of people who could serve in the army. And then, the fear would also be, like it was in Korea, that if you go too far, Chinese might send troops in. But even without China, the Vietnamese have millions and millions of people who could fight in the army against the Americans. For the United States, you're not going to send 1 million soldiers to Vietnam. The American people wouldn't put up with that, right? So Vietnam has these real advantages in terms of fighting a guerrilla war and having this, morale, right? So there we go. This destruction of Vietnam continues to make things worse, and it really it's kind of the worst thing you could do against a guerrilla war. Like
for centuries, the simple stick.
I'm not going to play this whole thing, but it's the reason I play some of them is because it might be possible that one or two of you don't watch the videos, at home or whatever. So sometimes I play all of them to make sure that you do. But really, it's important when I put these up here for a reason, so you really should watch them. But I'm just going to play a little bit of this because it's really interesting, because it shows how the United States is fighting this amazing war of technology. B-52 bombers, flamethrowers, artillery, armor, napalm, Agent Orange, helicopters, close air support, you name it. Like everything, state-of-the-art technology. And they're fighting against the Viet Minh or the Viet Cong later. And the Viet Cong, this is kind of how...
was used in a variety of combat environments. Even in an age of modern warfare, this cheap, low-tech weapon has proven valuable. US troops in Vietnam learned this the hard way. Viet Cong guerrillas lacked air power and artillery. Traps were a cost-effective way to significantly reduce the combat effectiveness of American infantry.
One individual being injured takes out 2 other people at one time. But everyone else in that squad is going to have to take their turn of carrying this individual and his equipment. So you've limited their combat effectiveness right off the bat. So if you can get 1 or 2 or even 3 people injured in that squad, then you've either limited or destroyed their combat effectiveness. That unit is no longer viable.
In Vietnam, the sticks were made from bamboo and were called punji.
There are different varieties or things that we use as punji stick. Probably one of the most effective is a simple piece of bamboo. As you can see, with the bamboo is cut off to a point like this and shaved properly, it's as sharp as a needle. The ability to penetrate bodies, clothing, is just phenomenal. It's nearly as good as steel. The effect is absolutely devastating.
The simplest trap was the punji pit, a hole bristling with sharp...
All right. So, look at that comparison, right? So the United States is fighting this amazing war of technology against these guerrillas who are using tactics that are, centuries, many centuries old. The United States was also using something called search and destroy operations. One of the tactics was called search and destroy. You go into a village and you just kill everything in sight, right? There's a book that came out a few years ago called Kill Anything That Moves, because a lot of American commanders kind of said that, right? If you're in a village, just assume that everybody is the enemy. Now, this led not only to alienating, to angering the local people who didn't want the Americans around, but it also led to significant massacres. There were many, and we're finding out more and more, the further we get away from the war, there were all kinds of incidents where American soldiers would go in and kill, civilians and women and old people and things like that. The most famous was at a place called Milai. Milai was a village. I don't think it's on this map specifically, but it's kind of in this area. It's on in the central region of Vietnam near the coast. I think it's somewhere around here. It's a small village, and a unit called Charlie Company, led by a guy named William Calley, went in to Milai, and the Viet Cong soldiers weren't there. They were out on a mission. So the people in Milai were the older people, the women, and the kids. Calley and Charlie Company massacred the village. They killed about 400 Vietnamese. They raped women. They killed children. There's this is rough to watch. I'm not going to play it, but there is if you're interested, and this is really difficult, but there's a PBS special called 4 Hours in Milai, which is really, really powerful. One of the few stories that come out of Vietnam that really, kind of showed some heroism was that at Milai, there was a helicopter flying over, commanded by Master Sergeant Hugh Thompson. And Hugh Thompson saw all these people on the ground dead, being pushed into a ditch, and thought that there had been a fight, a conflict. And as he got closer, he saw an American actually kill a Vietnamese woman. So he put his helicopter down in between the Vietnamese who were still alive and the American troops. And he ordered his American soldiers to train their guns on Charlie Company, other American soldiers, right? And then and Thompson got out and went up to Calley, and this is their conversation. Thompson was later interviewed, and he recounted this: "What's going on? It's my business. What is this? Who are these people? Just following orders. Orders? Whose orders? Just following." Thompson says, "These are human beings, unarmed civilians. Look, Thompson, this is my show. It ain't your concern." Great job. You better get back in the chopper and mind your own business. You ain't heard the last of this. Thompson reported it to his superiors who didn't do anything about it. There was an investigation which included Colin Powell, who would later become chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Secretary of State, and there was a cover-up. They didn't do anything about it. Finally, you know, you can't keep something like this a secret. Word got out. A veteran who was in Vietnam a year later, this occurred in March of 1968, a veteran who was in Vietnam a year later named Ron Ridenour heard about it, wrote a letter to his congressman and wrote a letter to a journalist named Seymour Hersh, and the story broke. Calley, who was responsible for this massacre, kind of became a hero, you know, because he was accused and arrested of war crimes. Thompson got death threats. Thompson, in the narrative of this, Thompson, who stopped the massacre, was the bad guy, and Calley, who was murdering and slaughtering and just absolutely terrorizing this village, was considered heroic, right? Calley was convicted. He was like in jail for a few days, and Richard Nixon didn't pardon him, but he gave him, he put him on house arrest. He let him out of jail, right? And so that's kind of the way the war was fought. Now, in Vietnam, those kinds of massacres obviously, you know, led to even more anger and alienation at the Americans. When Milai occurred, this was taking place at the same time as kind of one of the most important offensives and battles of the whole war, the so-called Tet Offensive, which you've probably heard of. It's kind of really the most important point in many ways of the Vietnam War. In early 1968, during Tet, which is the Lunar New Year, right, the Asian Lunar New Year, a ceasefire was called between all the sides in Vietnam, and the Vietnamese communists, the enemy, right? Northern troops came down, troops in the south came down, and they staged the Tet Offensive. When Tet occurred, they began an offensive that attacked every part of South Vietnam. Right? Now, the Americans have been saying things are great here. We've turned the corner. There's light at the end of the tunnel. We're doing well. We're killing off so many of these people, you know, because that death count became very important. You know, the idea there is, well, if you kill enough of them, they can't fight anymore, which, you know, just wasn't very sound. It was a kind of dumb policy. A lot of people in the military, you know, talked about that and told people in the Marines, for instance, this is stupid. You can't do this, right? And Tet kind of proved that. This is an image of Saigon, the capital city, during the Tet Offensive. Viet Cong guerrillas actually broke into the U.S. embassy and mortared the building and, you know, blew a hole up in the wall. They were then killed. But, you know, it's kind of hard to say things are going great, we're in great shape, when the enemy, you know, gets into the grounds of your embassy. So that then led, the Tet kind of made the Americans kind of reevaluate the war. And in 1968, and what they decided at that point was that they couldn't keep reinforcing and just sending more and more troops in and spending more and more money on Vietnam. So after 1968, the United States began to kind of change the nature of the war. I don't want to say they ended it or, you know, brought it down or de-escalated, because that's not really the case. What the U.S. did was begin to take troops home. Now, 1968 is also an election year, and Richard Nixon ran as the peace candidate. Nixon's the guy who said, you know, I'm going to end the war in Vietnam. I'm going to bring the boys home, right? At the same time, the American military decided it would be better to let the Vietnamese fight the Vietnam War. So this became a policy they called Vietnamization. Now, think about that. It's a bit kind of Orwellian, right? You're Vietnamizing the Vietnam War. You're telling the Vietnamese to fight the Vietnam War. And there was always this real, you know, tension between the Southern Vietnamese, the people the U.S. was there, you know, to support, to fight with, and the Americans. The Americans kept saying the South Vietnamese don't want to fight. They're going to let us fight and die for their country. And the South Vietnamese didn't like the Americans telling them all what to do. The people of Southern Vietnam weren't real happy with their government either, you know, like they weren't with Diem. The South Vietnamese government was pretty corrupt. It more or less controlled the drug trade in Southeast Asia. It, you know, took a lot of money, kind of like Jiang Jiechi had done, and, you know, they kept it for themselves. They weren't popular. The only reason they won elections is because the elections were kind of fixed and rigged. So things are not going well by any means by 1968. And so the United States understands that and says, we're going to start to let the Vietnamese do more of the fighting. Nixon won that election, and then he started to pull troops out. So by 1970, there's about 180,000 troops left in Vietnam. After Tet, the number had gone up to somewhere around 525 to 540,000 American troops. That's a big number. I mean, the most American troops in Iraq, I think, was 150,000, if that much. I don't really remember. But Vietnam was big. It's a small country, too. Keep that in mind. 550,000, whatever, 542,000, I think was the peak number. Troops in a country that's, imagine sending 542,000 troops to New Mexico or to Eastern Texas, or something like that. So the war isn't going well. Nixon starts to withdraw troops. But at the same time, he actually expanded the war because he began to attack Cambodia and Laos. So on one hand, he's bringing American troops home, which has impact on the anti-war movement, which I'll talk about briefly, because, once there aren't that many American soldiers in Vietnam, the need to protest isn't as great. But he's expanding the war by just sending the Air Force out to blow up Laos and Cambodia. And so the war actually got bigger in that sense, because it wasn't just in Vietnam now, it was in all of Indochina, right? And to skip ahead, it's a kind of a, spoiler alert, but in April of 1975, the communists won in all three of those places, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. So obviously not a great, strategic idea, right? So after Tet, then the Americans began to phase down and finally withdraw. In January of 1973, the Americans got out of Vietnam. They promised that they would continue to support the South Vietnamese, and they did to some extent, but by 1974, the revolution, that was the term the Vietnamese used for all of those forces, the People's Army of Vietnam, the People's Liberation Armed Forces, the Viet Cong, the National Liberation Front. All those people opposed to the Americans called themselves the Revolution. And in 1974, they began a final offensive. They began to send troops into South Vietnam. They assumed that it would take 2 or 3 years to finish the war off. They began the offensive at Christmas of 1974. By April of 1975, it was over. And the Vietnamese, the revolution crashed into the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon, the southern capital, and won the war. And this is a very famous, I'm not going to play, obviously not going to play with the thing.
Battling anxiety and depression has been a very big struggle.
It was absolute chaos. All your regulations went out the door that day. There was tremendous confusion.
It was like a tsunami of people.
Jerry Berry, 25-year Marine pilot, flew the Ambassador out of Saigon.
And you've probably all seen pictures and probably video of that where, these people are just like climbing over each other to try to get into the U.S. Embassy so that they can escape. These helicopters would get to ships where they would unload people, and they would often, because there was so much weight on the ships, they would just dump the helicopters into the water. Most of the people who got out in that first wave were officials in the South Vietnamese government or the South Vietnamese army. There are 2 or 3 waves of Vietnamese immigration. It's really fascinating stuff. One of my graduate students some years ago, a guy named Roy Vu, wrote a big dissertation about this, which is quite good. If you're ever interested, you can go to the UH library and find it. But the revolution had succeeded, the Americans had lost, right? So this is, not long after World War II. I mean, that was 1975. World War II ended in 1945. So just 30 years later, after the glorious victory of World War II, the United States had lost a war in this very small Asian country to a group of people, soldiers who, they fought a guerrilla war originally. After that, they did get aid from both the Soviet Union and the Chinese, but, it was just a massive blow to America's prestige, America's influence, America's credibility in the world. Right, they've gone from 1945. That still has power and everything else, but it was really a stunning reversal. All right. Now, one thing I'm going to do here, and then I'll actually talk more about it when we talk about the 60s, is talk a little bit about the anti-war movement at home, because a lot of people are interested in that. So the Vietnam War ended in 1974. Well, the U.S. got out in 1973. The war itself ended with the victory of the revolution in April of 1975. At that point, the real question for Americans became, why did we lose? How did we lose this war, right? How did the United States lose to this small guerrilla, peasant country, this agricultural country for the most part? And for a lot of people, there are a lot of explanations. One was that the U.S. politicians did not let the Vietnamese fight. They fought with one hand tied. The Americans fight in Vietnam. They fought with one hand tied behind their back. Okay, that's not true. And if you're really interested in that, you should check out Masters of War, which is the book I wrote about that topic. But a lot of people, and even to this day, still blame the anti-war movement. During the Vietnam War, there was a significant level of opposition to the war in the streets. So, in 2020, you've seen a lot of huge stuff, probably biggest, who knows since when. But the comparisons are generally to the 1960s, because in the 1960s, both with civil rights and then with the Vietnam War, you had huge numbers of Americans who were actually protesting very vigorously against the United States policies. So there were street protests of a significant magnitude. So 2020 is clearly the biggest and probably bigger than the 1960s. Now, these are just a few images of anti-war movements. There were, every big city had huge anti-war demonstrations and protests. Little cities had them as well. Marches, demonstrations, civil disobedience, things like that. So these are some images. This I put up because this is really an important group. Vietnam Veterans Against the War, because we have this image of particular image of soldiers. Many soldiers, a lot of soldiers, came back from Vietnam and thought the war was insane. They had seen it, they'd been there. So one of the most important groups opposing the war was called the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, VVAW. And they were always kind of at the front of every demonstration, the front of every rally. In 1971, VVAW had a huge demonstration in Washington, D.C., where a guy who became a senator from Massachusetts, then in 1974, was the Democratic nominee for president, John Kerry, was part of VVAW. He was their public spokesman in 1971. So it's a big and really important group. Scared the government because these guys are soldiers. They had credibility. They knew how to use guns. So the Vietnam War, the protest movement was quite significant. This is just a really one of the more famous photos. There was a big protest at the Pentagon where you have all these soldiers, kind of like the images from 2020, where you have the police with these guns and the protesters on the other side of it. And this kid went up and he put a flower in the barrel of this military policeman's weapon. And so, there is this significant movement against the war. Oh no. Let me see something here. I forgot to link it, damn it. Two of the cultural images, I'll play this later. There are two other things that I think are really kind of critically important when you talk about the anti-war movement at home. One was the role of Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King is a civil rights leader. We're going to talk about that. We're going to start talking about that pretty soon. But King also went beyond that and became a really significant voice against the Vietnam War. He wasn't just a preacher. He wasn't just a civil rights leader. He was also a peace activist. And in 1967, he gave a really famous speech that we don't really know much about. Americans don't talk about it that much. We all know King's I Have a Dream speech, which he gave at the March on Washington, which we'll talk about, and his last speech of his life, I've Been to the Mountaintop. But in 1967, he gave a speech about Vietnam. It was called A Time to Break the Silence. In it, because King didn't want to criticize the Vietnam War because he didn't want to get Lyndon Johnson and the Democratic Party upset because they had supported civil rights. But by 1967, King is saying, well, the Vietnam War is killing civil rights. All of this money, all of this emphasis is now going on the war in Vietnam instead of stuff that's happening here at home. So he gives a very powerful speech. It's almost an hour long, so I'm certainly not gonna. These intro ads are a pain in the butt. So you should listen to this. If you were to put a question on the test about it, in it, King does a lot of stuff. He connects civil rights to the war at home, and he says, we have people, black and white kids in Vietnam, fighting and dying together in Vietnam to bring rights to the Vietnamese. even though they wouldn't be able to sit at the same restaurant in the United States, they wouldn't go to the same schools. You know, these Black Americans wouldn't have the rights in the United States that they're fighting for in Vietnam. It's kind of like, you know, World War I, a war to make the world safe for democracy. It's that kind of idea, right? And so King was really important. And you know, whenever you have this movement, it generally starts out, in the Vietnam movement started out with young people, college students on campuses. They would have protests. They started having teach-ins. The government called them communists, right? Lyndon Johnson was always saying the anti-war movement was run by communists. The communists had taken over the anti-war movement. So when somebody like King or Dr. Spock, if you've ever heard of Dr. Spock, ask your grandparents. If you don't know who he is, I don't know if they still use it. He wrote a book on how to raise babies and children, which is one of the most famous books of the 20th century. Dr. Spock came out against the Vietnam War. So when people like Martin Luther King and Dr. Spock and a lot of generals and a lot of businessmen started to attack the Vietnam War and say the United States has to get out, that's important, because what it does is it tells people that it's okay to oppose the war. People who otherwise, they're not political activists, they're certainly not radicals, they're not in the streets, they're not in any of these kinds of protests. Now, if King is criticizing the war, in this speech, A Time to Break the Silence, King, you know, really angered a lot of people. I mean, what it did was it gave encouragement to some people to protest the war. If it was okay for King to do it, it was okay for them, but it also pissed off a lot of people too. And especially because at one point, King says, my message is directed to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, the United States government, right? King called the US government the most violent nation in the world in 1967. That's a big deal. And you can imagine the people in charge of the government, Lyndon Johnson and others, didn't like that. A lot of Americans didn't either, but it was really crucial, right? The other thing I was going to play, which I'll do when I talk about the 60s, is a song, maybe the most famous anti-war song of the Vietnam War. I feel like I'm fixing to die rag. You may have heard it. It was played at Woodstock by a guy named Country Joe McDonald. Country Joe was a political activist as well as a singer. And it's a really good example of kind of the critique of the Vietnam War. And I'll play that later. All right. So that's Vietnam. In what, an hour and 15 minutes or something like that, combine the two classes. Really quick. Like I said, if you're interested, you go to YouTube. History 3322 has, I don't know, 26 lectures on it or something like that. Probably more about Vietnam than you'd ever want to know. I mean, I recorded a while ago, so it's not exactly up to date, but the history, the history is the history. So it's still, useful if you're interested in learning more about that. Vietnam is important for lots of reasons, but like it's shows the limits of American power. So even though, the U.S. had 6% of the population and 50% of the wealth of the world, and was trying to maintain that, it suffered a defeat in Vietnam. Now in Korea, it didn't really accomplish what it set out to do. Korea remained divided, but in Vietnam, the United States could not prevent this guerrilla army, this nationalist army led by, initially the Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh and then others. They could not prevent them from defeating first the French and then the Americans and uniting Vietnam. In 1975, Vietnam was finally united. Now, the war itself was catastrophic for Vietnam. The United States dropped remember, this is a country the size of New Mexico. The United States dropped, I believe, somewhere around 4.5 to 5 million tons of bombs in Vietnam, right? 4.5 to 5 million tons. So, do the math on that. So the United States suffered a defeat against this guerrilla army. I'm actually curious now, so I'm gonna do the math. 9.2 billion pounds of bombs in a country the size of New Mexico, right? Destroyed Vietnam. So Vietnam in 1975, even though they had won the war, had to rebuild, and that became really problematic and difficult too. And in fact, I'll put something up on here because I wrote an article about that just a few months ago, which actually talks about that in some detail. So the United States, coming off of the great victory, this amazing power of World War II, this Cold War power, suffered a defeat, no doubt about it. It failed to win in Vietnam. So that was really critically important. It divided American society. This whole idea of the national security state, of conformity, was rocked by the Vietnam War. Millions of people were in the streets. Millions of people were protesting. Millions of people, really became angry at the U.S. government. There was a level of radicalism, radical groups. Think of 2020, and that's kind of what the 60s were like. So it really disrupted all of the harmony and triumph and this sense of invincibility, really, that had occurred in the Cold War. Vietnam kind of blew that up, right? So it's really critically important, both globally and here at home, right? And it took place, in making it even more important, the Vietnam War took place at the same time, almost virtually, like they run in parallel paths, as the civil rights era, the modern civil rights era in the United States, right? Now, I'm not going to go into it in a lot of detail today. What I want to do is just talk a little bit, kind of as a, give a little background to it. This is where not being in class is really a problem, because I always start this with a fairly decent and decently long discussion inside the classroom about the civil rights era. What do you know about it? What does it mean? What happened? That kind of thing, right? And so not having the ability to do that right now, makes it more difficult. But so what I want to do is just talk a little bit about it, just that, like the background. The thing is, these courses are called survey courses, which means you take a survey of U.S. history. You just look at different parts of it. We're talking from the Civil War to the present. So, that's a long time. That's 150 years plus. So you can't go into detail on everything. And so you try to pick and choose, and certain things are obviously more important. So I'm going to spend more time on civil rights, but you could spend their classes, every college in America, just on this topic, right? And so, we can't do that here. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about civil rights in the United States. It says racism, law, violence, the economy, through slavery and segregation up to Black Lives Matter. It's still an issue. This is still, I think, the dominant social issue in the United States. W.E.B. Du Bois, a name I mentioned before, in 1900 wrote, the problem of the 20th century will be the problem of the color line, meaning race. So in 1900, Du Bois wrote that, coming off of the failures of Reconstruction, the reimposition of these, sharecropping and things like that, these forms of white supremacy, the emergence of the Ku Klux Klan, lynchings, continued violence. And he was saying that, that hadn't been fixed, and in the 20th century was going to be that's still going to be an issue. Now, finally, in the 1960s, that issue was addressed, because they failed to do it in the 1860s, which we talked about in the very first class. But even then, it was done so in limited ways, which is why we still have this issue burning, and especially in, here in 2020. All right. So remember, on the first day, right, in the Civil War, after the Civil War, you had those 3 amendments that abolished slavery, gave blacks, men, the right to vote, and provided citizenship for African Americans. But that led to sharecropping and continued segregation, Jim Crow laws, which validated segregation, Plessy versus Ferguson, a court decision which said separate was equal. You could have separate facilities for blacks and whites, whether it be like the case itself was about where you were allowed to sit on a train, when you took a trip, which meant that, you would have unequal conditions, obviously. And so there were always civil rights movements. It didn't just come out of nowhere in the 1960s by any means. In World War I, I said, African Americans said, heard Wilson say, this is a war to make the world safe for democracy. So to them, that meant that democracy would come at home too. And many blacks went and joined the U.S. Army in World War I, the Great War, for that reason. And they came home, and things didn't change. You had the, lynchings continued. You had racial riots. The podcast that we did, I think a lot of you have listened to it, on Camp Logan, which occurred at Houston, was really important in this. So, that's when the NAACP, the National Association for Advancement of Colored People, was established, and during World War I. But still, America's racial system, the system of apartheid in the South. If you ever heard that word apartheid, South Africa doesn't exist in the same form anymore. It was always used to describe South Africa. but it's not unique to that. Apartheid means that you have a system in which different people are separated by their distinctions, by their differences. And it can be, in the United States, it's obviously racial, right? You know, black versus white. It can be religious, it could be ethnic. There can be different forms of apartheid, for sure. A lot of people use the word apartheid today to describe Israel and its treatments of Palestinians. So it can have ethnic implications, cultural implications, religious implications, and in the case of the United States, racial implications. So the South was an apartheid system. And what that meant was that legally, not just people were racist or people were mean or people were bigoted, but legally, black and white people had different rights. The rights that you just have by virtue of being born, right? Once you're born, you have these inalienable rights, you know, these Bill of Rights, right? The 10 Amendments, free speech and free expression and the ability to travel and all that kind of stuff. You know, and there are laws that establish public education, you know, all that kind of stuff, equality. By virtue of just by being born, you're supposed to get those rights. Well, in southern states, not only did you not have those, it wasn't just because people were mean or people were racist or people were bigoted. It was the law. Now, the North could be as racist as the South, but Northern laws weren't apartheid laws, right? So in the South, what you had was called de jure, D-E-J-U-R-E, segregation, which meant by law. In the North, what you had was de facto segregation, which meant by fact that it happened, right, in housing and things like that. But there's clearly a big difference between the North and South. The North is in no way racially tolerant. It has discrimination there. The South has laws on the books that, you know, make it mandatory for blacks to have fewer rights. They're only allowed to go to schools with other blacks. They can only go to restaurants with other blacks. They're only allowed to use restrooms or water fountains that are specifically designated, colored only. I know you've all seen photos, you know, of that. So what you have in the South then is an apartheid system, a legal system of segregation. So they're not breaking the law. When, you know, Southerners are denied the right to eat at a restaurant or to vote, is a big part, obviously a huge part of it is voting rights, right? Like if Southern states deny blacks the right to vote, they're not breaking the law. That's legal. Slavery was legal in the South, right? So that's an apartheid system in the South. And Wilson's crusade during World War I didn't change that. The war to make the world safe for democracy. Wilson did not intend that to occur at home. And Wilson himself really had these really kind of racist ideas. You know, I've mentioned Birth of a Nation and all that kind of stuff. So you have this racism which never changed from the Civil War onward. But racism, you know, is these ideas that people have. But racism needs power to really be dangerous, right? It's not just, racism isn't just like, I don't like people. Racism is having the power to harm people. And that generally occurs through the law. And that's what apartheid did in the South. So African Americans were not allowed to buy homes in certain neighborhoods. We talked about that with like Levittown anyway. So it continues way beyond that, right? So you have these legal means. You can't buy homes. You're not allowed to be in certain neighborhoods. You know, if you're in a certain area, the police might hassle you or beat you. Black men are often accused of crimes, including rape, for simply looking at a white woman in what was considered the wrong way. Whites called it reckless eyeballing. If you looked at a white woman the wrong way, you could be arrested for rape, right? So you have these legal conditions which make racism powerful and oppressive. So it's not just, we don't like you, you know, we don't like people who are black, or we don't like Catholics, or we don't like whoever, Jews or whatever. It's way more than that. It's a legal system, and it's having the power to actually impose those ideas and harm people with them. And that often leads to violence, and it will in the 1960s as well. Now, this occurred through slavery, through segregation, where you had neighborhoods and schools and railroad cars and restaurants and roads and water fountains and restrooms and parks and everything separated by race. Now, the Supreme Court said, you know, it's okay to be separate if it's equal. Well, obviously these things are not equal. black and white schools are nowhere near equal, but it didn't matter. You just say they're equal, right? So you have this apartheid system in the South. African Americans have been demanding civil rights really since the War for Independence. Well, before that, in the 1600s, it's slave rebellions and things like that. So what's happening after World War II isn't new, but it became more potent after World War II. And I think I mentioned this the other day. In World War II, the United States said we're going to fight the war to end Nazism, to end fascism. We're against the fascists. We're against those people who carry swastika flags. Just like in the 1860s, they fought a war against those people who carried Confederate flags. You guys aren't, you guys are enemies of the United States. And so African Americans heard that and said, okay, we demand that same consideration here at home. And after World War II, just like after World War I, soldiers came back and began a movement for civil rights. Now, after World War II, it had a lot more impact and a lot more success. And there are a lot of reasons for this. And I'll go over a few and then we'll wrap. During the Depression in the 1930s and then again during World War II, huge numbers of African Americans moved from the South to the North. In the period after, from Reconstruction onward, most blacks still lived in the South and most were involved in agriculture. There was still sharecropping well into the 1930s and even beyond that. So when the Depression hit, remember when they had, I mentioned they had subsidies, a lot of farmers got paid to not grow crops with the Agricultural Adjustment Act. That meant that they just got rid of their sharecroppers. And a lot of African Americans moved to the North. And then during World War II, they moved to the North. So now you had the creation of urban areas with significant black population and blacks working in better jobs than they would have before. And sometimes they were able to join unions, often not. Unions were as racist as any other institution in the period after World War II. So you have significant pockets of population of African Americans in a lot of northern areas. And they voted. They had to be taken seriously, right? Politicians would say, hey, I need to get the black vote. So they would go in there and say, who are the leaders of your community, and talk to them and say, will you tell your people to vote for us? And then in turn, we'll do something to help you out. There's still discrimination in jobs and neighborhoods and all that kind of stuff. So I'm not trying to in any way say that the North was some kind of Garden of Eden, not at all. But it was, significantly different. And then African Americans became important, especially in the Democratic Party, which is ironic, right? Because the Democratic Party was the party of racists, of violent racists in the South, but it also became the party of civil rights in the North. And that's why in the 1960s, everything blew up. And Democrats in the South who remained racist joined the Republican Party. So the modern parties are very different than what they were, let's say, in the mid-20th century. In the mid-20th century, the Democratic Party in the South was still very racist. By the 1960s, the Democratic Party was losing those Southerners who were becoming Republicans over these civil rights issues because blacks were joining and voting for and supporting the Democratic Party. Because of that, to get back to my point, there was a greater movement, a more successful movement to do something about these racial issues after World War II. You have a significant population of African Americans now in the North, especially in cities. Many of them are working. Some of them are joining unions. Some of them have a political importance. The federal government took action. The President, Harry Truman, issued an executive order desegregating the military. Ironically, the military is often one of the first places where you'll see social reform. I say ironically because we think of the military as a fighting force, right, or a conservative force. In reality, like in the 1990s and early 2000s, one of the first areas where gay rights was kind of played out was in the military, allowing people who are openly gay to serve in the military. Because before that, you could be dishonorably discharged for being gay, right? And so these social issues often play out in the military. So the President, Harry Truman, in the 1940s, issued an executive order saying, no longer will units be segregated in the military. They will be integrated. Blacks can become officers and so on. The Democrats realized that black votes could help them win elections. The Cold War, which I mentioned the other day, was a part of this, right? If the United States is fighting this Cold War against the Soviet Union, saying these guys are horrible and they're awful and they're trying to take over the world and they're satanic and they're evil and they're denying you freedom, then it looks bad, and the rest of the world was pointing this out, that America's race relations were so horrible, that you had an apartheid system in the South. Remember, I don't know if it's true, but that story about Stalin and Roosevelt at Yalta, where Roosevelt keeps saying, what are you going to do about Poland? We need democracy in Poland. We need free elections in Poland. What about Poland? What about Poland? And Stalin looks at him and says, what about Mississippi? All right. So the Cold War is an important element of that. There's another important element of that too, which is expanding the American economy. Kennan said we have 6% of the population, 50% of the wealth, and we need to make that bigger. Well, that applies at home too. I mentioned that the other day with regard to the American economy in the 50s. If you want to expand the economy, that means you have to have as many people involved in the economy as possible. And segregation, apartheid, meant that the economies were separate too. Blacks had, in black neighborhoods, you had African-American stores, you had African-American auto dealerships, African-American theaters, right? So blacks were consigned to their own economic areas as well, which meant that they were not shopping at, the big like Sears and Roebuck department stores or Woolworths department stores, things that were big at the time. Instead of going to big theaters downtown, they would go to smaller theaters in African-owned communities. They would shop at stores where, in their own neighborhoods. They would buy cars from people in their own neighborhoods, which meant that they weren't participating in this much larger economy. If you've ever watched the show Mad Men, which I've mentioned a couple times, but that was a story line in more than a few episodes where these advertisers were saying, hey, we need to start to go after the Negro market. They're not buying the things that we need to sell because we need the economy to get bigger. In 1950, there were, and the math is easy even for me, in 1950, the population of the United States was about 150 million, and African Americans made up about 15 million of that, or 10%, right? So that's, 15 million people is a big group who are not fully participating, in some areas not participating at all in the American economy. So that's important too. If you open up civil rights, you also open up economic rights. And much of the civil rights movement was based on that idea, right? If you're going to protest your right to take a bus or sit at a lunch counter or eat at a certain restaurant or go to certain places, go to department stores, which were segregated as well before that. If you're going to protest all that, that means what you're doing is demanding your right to spend money at these particular places too. So that's another reason civil rights is taken far more seriously and actually successfully after World War II, because it expands the economy by expanding these consumer rights as well. So civil rights and consumer rights, often dovetail, right? So after, so you've had this civil rights movement going on in the United States really forever, from the days of slave rebellions onward. But after World War II, and that civil rights movement is legal in the South, that racism is powerful because it involves power, it involves law, it often involves violence. Through slavery, through segregation, and after World War II, because of all these reasons, African-American migration to the North, the demands of the Cold War, desegregation of the military, the desire of political parties to have black votes, the need to expand the economy and bring African-Americans in as consumers. All of these things come together, and so the civil rights movement after World War II becomes much more successful from the early 1950s until the mid-1960s, right? And that's always seen as the triumph of civil rights in the 1960s. Well, and it is, but it's still being contested. And so what you're seeing today, especially with Black Lives Matter and the government, the official government response from Washington, D.C. to Black Lives Matter is really indicative of a much earlier time in American history. This year we're seeing big political fights over Confederate statues, over U.S. military bases named after Confederate generals, the people who lost the war to the United States. We're seeing, battles over, NASCAR has banned the Confederate flag. Yet you have a president who called Black Lives Matter terrorists. So this stuff is still being played out today, which is why talking about it, and this is really would be nice to be in a classroom, really kind of have a nice discussion about this. But that's why talking about it in 2020 and learning about it and the history of it in 2020 is really vital. And I probably will spend a little more time on it than I normally would because of that. I think, history has to be somehow relevant, right? You have to learn what went on. Not necessarily, I mean, I don't know if anybody learns from the mistakes of the past. Certainly 2020 would indicate not much. But, you have to know this stuff, and I mean, there's really actually been a renaissance too in African-American history this year. If you're a sports fan, I watch the NBA a lot. I love it, and basketball. And, the stuff that was going on in the bubble was really quite amazing. It was almost, I kept saying, this is like a seminar in African-American history. Charles Barkley, Kenny Smith, Shaq, Isaiah Thomas gave an interview where he was talking about this very famous book by a guy named Theodore Allen, The Invention of the White Race. He was talking about Bacon's Rebellion. You had African-Americans talking about Black history in ways, people like LeBron James, very famous. Megan Rapinoe, soccer player, was, Colin Kaepernick, right? So this is really important. There's been this explosion of interest now in African-American history because it's so vital to understanding America's racial conditions, right? So it's important stuff. Really, really read Vietnam and civil rights. We're going to talk a little bit more about it. Stay on top of things. You know the routine by now. This is number 17. We're making good progress. We're well on our way, and we'll see you again soon. If you have any questions, hit up the TAs first. If I'm getting all these emails about like extra credit and stuff like that, and where do I turn this in or whatever. It's just easier to go straight to your TA because I'll pass it on to them anyway, and you can eliminate the middleman and get to them quickly. And if you have any like issues or concerns, they're going to have to deal with it because they're doing the grading. Now, after that, obviously, you can talk to me anytime you want. But in terms of the actual grading, they're doing it, not me. So you want to talk to them first. There will be more extra credit stuff going on. Also, and I'll put a line up on that where I just mentioned, like the NBA. I recently, I think, I have a podcast, right? And I recently talked to a sports writer who's been really involved in covering these issues, Colin Kaepernick, LeBron James, sports and all that kind of stuff. So if you're a sports fan, check it out. I'll put it up on the webpage too, on the syllabus or the outline or something like that too at the Green and Red podcast. It's not an assignment or anything like that. It's just if you're interested in sports and how sports has become activist, then you might get a kick out of it. Anyway, enjoy, do your work, be careful, be safe, and we'll see you again soon.